Welcome, Vivek, Saurabh, and Dr. Sinha. We have been continuing a series of town halls on demand planning and forecasting. This is under the aegis of Center for Supply Chain Management in the Institute of Supply Chain. And in the first two town halls, we looked at supply chain planning. Then we looked at forecasting, the future of forecasting. And we come here to look at different approaches that companies have followed, which are contemporary, which are being followed. And there's a debate between these approaches in terms of managing the supply chain during the COVID-19. And it is very important, we thought, as a institution to understand these different approaches and the differences in the approaches. And so we thought when we had these town halls, we saw that because of demand shifts and supply chain disruptions, there have been various approaches that have been, floating around. If you see Oliver and Wright writing about IBP as the only solution in the post-COVID-19 process, if you have the Demand-Driven Institute writing DDMRP as the only solution in the post-COVID and within the COVID approaches. So I thought, and obviously there are a large number of muscle players like SAP, Blue Yonder, O9, Anaplan talking about connected planning, taking it to autonomous DDMRP, or they call it as HANA IBP. There's so many kind of systems that have also emerged as alternatives. There has been a lot of confusion also around these basic approaches to demand planning or supply chain planning. So I thought this would be a good time to end the town halls with this different approaches and get people who have practiced this to discuss the approaches in a very scientific and in a very art manner. So it's scientific as well as artistic. So it's something that we will look into it, and how organizations have actually lived with these approaches and what are the learning from these approaches. Because we have a panel where Saurabh is living with DDMRP and IBP together. We have Dr. Sinha, who is a strong proponent of DDMRP. I think 3 days back we had a master classes. He said RIP forecasting. So I think we'll have an interesting take from him on those things. And then we have Vivek, who has practiced IBP within a single company, but across the globe. India, East Asia, Middle East and Africa, and a very thorough mind on IBP, and has a very strong understanding of IBP as far as I understand. What would be the post-COVID approach to planning? Because if you see, there is a general trend which is saying that from a deterministic planning, we move towards more resilient planning. Now, how would this change different approaches different companies have been adopting? How would different companies look at the phases of pandemics and the post-pandemic, the day one, as Vivek writes in one of his articles for our portal? How do you really start, perceiving the supply chain and then the planning around it? So let me start the debate from our star panel. I'll go back to somebody who is very active in this pandemic, and he says single minute exchange of diet as single minute. What is that? Single minute supply chain plan.
Yeah, single minute change of plans.
Change of plan. So I think that's interesting. Saurabh, let's start with you, because he also has been telling me in private that he's also facing the same dilemma as a question that what would be the best approach to move towards planning in the future. So I think you can really look at the pandemic, the challenges, and obviously your approaches to planning in the last 1 year. Let's broad base the horizon from just pandemic to pre-pandemic and maybe post.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Singh. Very happy to be here with really smart minds in planning and DDMRP. Like, these are thought leaders. So please do excuse me if you find some of my ideas pretty basic. I'll come more from a practitioner's point of view, and hopefully, use the inputs from the experts here to clarify and strengthen my own thoughts. So, Dr. Singh, one of the key things is, I've always been a big believer in DDMRP, right? So how do you respond to market demand and into pull-based systems? And one of the biggest, gurus for me would be Dr. Eli Goldratt, right? Through his TOC approach. So it's a mix that I will talk about. I don't have a single, single thought. It's been put together, and certainly Dr. Rakesh Sinha has also helped me fructify my thoughts, come to some sort of an understanding. Before COVID, I had been working for a very long time into trying to figure out what's the best way to respond to market demand, right? Whenever we look at forecasting, and I spoke to various companies, first thing which came in top was that forecast. We always talk about accuracy. We know that a forecast is wrong, right? So any company which executes to a forecast will always be having huge amount of variabilities in their supply, and therefore the consequent customer order delays or the fill rate losses, etc. So the first thing was, of course, try and improve the demand planning, which is to say, can we go to a higher forecast accuracy? And I've seen teams which said, I'm at 75% forecast accuracy and I want to go to 78% next year. And my question would there be that 3% increase in accuracy, is it going to give you a real world improvement in your sales, right? Or is it just something which is good to do, and the amount of effort which goes around it? So therefore, breaking apart the forecasting and the execution. Forecasting, you use it like Dr. Sinha has very clearly put it. You use it for resource planning, you use for capacity planning, you use it for demand shaping, etc. But the day-to-day execution, right, is what you use your pull-based systems for. So whatever gets sold, you get the signals very, very quickly into your manufacturing plants, into your distribution centers, and then you start supplying to that. There is a dichotomy, and I'll come to that subsequently. So during the pandemic, it became extremely clear that the forecast models have all gone for a toss, right? So even if I use, whether I use a 5-year model or the last 3-month model, it's going to give me two very, very different answers, right? And my day-to-day execution is really limited by what happens hyper-locally. So what happens in Chennai 2 days back, when they locked it down, my CFA went out of operation, means I have to quickly work around it within 24 hours. Now, is a pull system going to help me there? Very honestly, even a pull system does not work because the CFA is closed. Does a forecasting system work? It doesn't, because it can never forecast when it is going to shut down, when it's going to open up, right? So it's really, a pull system has helped me ensure enough stock is available as per the demand. But I have to quickly work around and find solutions around it. As I look forward, and some semblance, let's say, some semblance of normalcy, I'm not saying the normal ways of working, there are innovation products being talked about. There are new pack sizes being talked about to take care of what the demand is there, new demand is there in the market, right? Pull system does not help me there, but I do need a forecasting. I do need some sort of a sense of what is it that we are going to make, how much is this to be made, where all are you going to sell. So someone goes out and says, I'll be reaching out to 50,000 shops across India, and therefore for each shop, for this assortment, this is the type that I need. Okay, so my first fill, the innovation thing is done. What about the second fill? How much is it going to be sold? So then it goes into a pull system, but the pull system does not have enough data to build a good inventory model around it, right? So that's where the dichotomy comes. For an established system, DDMRP is working well for me. For new products, I do need a forecast, but within 2 or 3 months, that forecast is going to have no value for me. So where do I go? What is this connected planning that we talk about? I don't think the challenge is going to be too different than it was in the current or post-COVID situation. It's still going to be, what do I make, when do I send it, and how do I ensure my customer orders are protected and filled on time. I hope that gives you some sort of an idea where what we are working.
I think you have started off well, confusing all of us. You said you're a big proponent of DDMRP, and at the end you questioned it in the most dynamic format when it's supposed to have been worked well. Let me go to Dr. Sinha. Dr. Sinha, I will go back to some questions which emerges from Saurabh's simple and frank analysis of the situation later. But I'm very curious to understand that how does DDMRP differ from SNOP, IBP, which are, according to you, different approaches, and why is forecasting dead? Because this would really, RIP forecasting is a very interesting concept. As I've told you, I've also read an article, Death of Supply Chains, where they say the supply chain also is dead, because probably when there is a control tower, the article in Harvard Business School says, the Business Review says, then the visibility will and granularity that comes out of that visibility will kill any planning. But I think let me not get into that particular domain. Let me get into DDMRP, which is catching up also. I've been seeing articles saying that this pandemic DDMRP popularities have gone up. So what is, before getting into DDMRP, how is it different than SNOP, IBP, and even a forecasting-based planning?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Singh. Let me first clarify. If you see the slide, the RIP slide in my master class, the title was very clearly that death of conventional forecasting for supply actions. So we are talking of not forecasting, but conventional forecasting, and we are not talking of its long-range usefulness, but only for supply actions. There's a very important concept in TOC called relevant ranges. Each tool, each model is useful in a particular range. Just as we can't use a sword to cut onions, we shouldn't be using a tool which is meant for a particular range outside its range. So if you look at it, DDMRP's range is short-term supply actions, day-to-day supply actions over the next few days, a month, max 2 months or 3 months, not beyond that. If you start using DDMRP for 4 months down, what needs to be done, then it's not useful. Its range is short-term. Forecasting and SNOP, IBP has its range, useful range in the medium and long term, say 3 months to 6 months, 9 months or 12 months. So if I need to decide whether I need to set up another capacity, which may take 18 months for me to set up, then DDMRP is not useful. We have to go back to IBP. If I want to decide as the volumes are picking up whether I need to in-source certain products or outsource if the demand is dropping, DDMRP is not going to be useful. IBP is useful. So both have a very symbiotic relationship. Just as a telescope and a microscope, both are used for looking at objects, but their ranges are so different that we can't use a telescope for a close range and we can't use a microscope for a large range. So ranges are different. The moment we understand that each tool has a usefulness in a particular range, we come to the conclusion that both have a very symbiotic relationship. DDMRP draws inputs from IBP, very useful inputs, and IBP takes a lot of input from the way DDMRP is planning in the short run. So both have to exist together, both have to feed on each other's strengths and thereby become better. We can't just replace one with another. The problem with many companies is that they are using a single tool for short term as well as long term. So IBP is good for long term, but if you start using for short term action as to what should I dispatch today or what should I manufacture today, that's where we face a problem. And similarly, DDMRP, if you start using it for decisions which are necessarily long term in nature, then that's not the right way. Both have to exist simultaneously, both have to feed on each other. There's a very, very symbiotic relationship between both of them. So I am not suggesting that we do away with IBP. I'm suggesting that we use both, but let's be cognizant of the ranges in which they are useful. So that would be my, and this holds true during pandemic, pre-pandemic, post. These are just the basic principles of planning, which hold good.
Another question. another question which I think looms large in mind of people. What is the basic difference between MRP and DDMRP?
Yeah.
Where is the fundamental difference?
Yeah.
And where is the the cutting edge for DDMRP in the process of planning? Because people sometimes believe it's just MRP, they do not understand the difference. So if you could just tell us these differences, and also the differences from conventional planning, because or conventional forecasting. Because if you look at some of the newer approaches, that's fine. But I think you were doing away with the in that master class, which was very interesting and good, well conceptualized. You said conventional planning like SNOP and IBP does not hold true for the short term, obviously. Yeah, and but before getting into the second question, I would go to the first question, and I think that would haunt everybody's mind when people come from alternative approaches. What is the difference between DDMRP and MRP? Where are the fundamental differences?
Yeah, there's only one difference in my opinion. If you go back to when MRP was developed in the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around that, MRP starts with master production schedule, the starting point of MRP. And MRP is used for generally the input materials planning. So you start with the master production schedule, and whether it's in a detailed form or it's a consolidated form, aggregate form, you start from there. Then very useful concepts of netting off inventory, netting off for the lead time, all those concepts are very good. But the starting point is master production schedule, which comes mainly from the forecast. Forecast leads to an MPS, and MPS is used for MRP, exploding the bill of materials into the requirement planning. In DDMRP, the starting point is not MPS, because MPS is not something which is cast in stone. It's very dynamic. It keeps changing every day, the production schedule. So starting point is the consumer. So if the consumer has bought something, that should trigger a production schedule, and then the production schedule onwards, it's more or less like the traditional MRP to find out what input materials would be required. But the starting point shifts. Instead of production schedule, starting point becomes what the consumer is buying in the market. Now, how do you link that to a dynamic production scheduling and then use a traditional MRP for? So that's why it's called demand-driven MRP, not production schedule-driven MRP. So in my opinion, that's the only difference.
But that's where the conventional forecasting is also a problem in terms of managing short-term supplies and demand.
Correct, because conventional forecasting, again, I come back to my favorite. There are three major drawbacks, four major drawbacks of it's done too much in advance, it's done too infrequently, it's done at an aggregate level, and it allows human touch. So all these four things either add to the inaccuracy of forecast or add to the bias in the forecast. The fourth point adds to the forecast bias, and the first 3 points lead to either improving the accuracy or taking it further down. So in DDMRP, the type of forecast, it's not that forecasts are not used. We use either the average daily usage as the starting point in DDMRP, ADU as it's called, which is based on the current trend in the past, recent past, very recent past. Or for certain items, we use the forecasted demand daily usage, FDU, as it is called. So when it comes to FDU, we do use forecasting, but in a very short term, over the next 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, how is it going to be how is it going to pan out at a very granular level, at SKU level, at the granular, at a distributor level, not an aggregate product group level and a state level. That doesn't help. It needs to be done at a very granular level, and that has to be done daily to look at the next 3 days or 5 days or 7 days or max 15 days of how the demand is expected. So it's not that forecasting is not used. The techniques of forecasting are different, the tools are different, and the time horizon is vastly different from conventional forecasting.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sinha. We'll come back to you on those. There are a lot of queries in my mind, at least because of the the new inquisitiveness in DDMRP. But let me go back to Vivek. Vivek, welcome. I think, Vivek, I would ask you a very simple question. how is the IBP used in planning, and how has it evolved over a period of time? I'll put the pandemic at the last because that's where we'll go to see where we are moving. But how IBP as a planning, both short-term, long-term planning, how it is more than planning, and how few organizations believe that it can shape the organizational supply chain as a part of the business strategy.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, and great to be with Saurabh and Dr. Sinha. I think, Saurabh, you said that you were going to talk about basic concepts. I think you talked about the most complex problems and the solutions. And I think Dr. Sinha was extremely lucid in explaining the difference between DDMRP and IBP. So thanks for that. It was, I mean, I was also kind of learning. So coming to your question, Dr. Singh, see, I personally feel planning has got very simple objective of reaching a business objective while with the resources you have. So whether you are operating in the short-term zone, or a long-term zone, or a medium-term zone, you are only worried about how do you meet your objective and what are the resources commitment you need to have. So from that perspective, whether it is pre-COVID, during COVID, or post-COVID, this doesn't change. Now the nature of objective and the nature of constraints do change in the three horizons. So for example, I mean, if you look at during COVID, the only objective of a short-term planning, or in the words of Dr. Sinha, DDMRP, should be conserve cash. So what is good for cash conservation is what the way the planning should work through. So are you going to go a bit ballistic on, because some of the industries were growing, for example, pharmaceutical, some category in pharmaceutical, some category in home goods like groceries were growing, but to what extent you want to support that growth without running out of cash? Because some of your categories will not grow, where your cash will get tied up in terms of inventory. Some of the channels may get dried because of, in terms of your receivables. So this is the fine balance you'll have to run through in your short-term horizon. So your objective of short-term normally is drive service at an optimum cost. I think during COVID, it will straight away go to conserve cash. If I have to explain in terms of analogy, I think we all understand cricket. So if it's like when you go out in open and within first over, if you are 0 runs and 4 wickets down, your plans have to change completely. So you will try to conserve your wickets. You will not worry about whether you're leaving a full toss and blocking it, but you will try to conserve wickets. And that's the stage during COVID all of us were. And so there I would say two things are very important: your people safety and your cash. You have to run these two things with that objective. You have to run your short-term planning. Now the challenge in the same environment is that how you start visualizing the world reshaping itself in the COVID and after the COVID scenario. And I think I think good thing is there are three. I would say the opportunity which this crisis offers us are around twofold. One, we were probably in our country, in India, and I think we are blessed with the kind of entrepreneurship and the kind of startup culture around technology we have. And I think we have to exploit that to our best of the advantage. So how do we make our planning intelligent? So intelligent means can we start accelerating in the area of artificial intelligence, etc. I think that's one opportunity. The second opportunity is how do we drive more collaboration? Because this crisis, which is happening and which will continue to be, in my opinion, at least for 18 to 24 months, will need strong end-to-end collaboration with all other functions. So it's a great opportunity for an organization to reshape its way of working and the behaviors which are needed to tide over this. And I think the third thing which is important is how are you, in a way, visualizing this landscape which is changing, which is mainly around consumer, and I think also around channel. So for example, the values of the consumer are shifting. So this is not a demand, I mean, the demand has not receded, demand has been stopped. But when it comes back, the form and the nature of that demand will be very different. So it will have effect on portfolio first. So let me explain to you for our company, how are we seeing that? When it comes to portfolio, for example, C-class SKUs, which were not selling anyway, therefore even they were C-class. Can they sell in COVID times? I mean, definitely not. So we just took a decision, blanket decision, no scientific analysis, that we'll stop producing at least 35 to 40% of our C-class SKUs immediately. So we discontinued those SKUs. The second challenge around consumer side will be how purposeful the consumption will be, because you would yourself as a consumer would realize that there was a lot of expenditure which all of us do, which are not needed for human life. I mean, for human day-to-day life, and therefore the consumer will become more purposeful. Recession is definitely coming, so cost consciousness will also, or value consciousness will increase. So the consumer landscape, in short, if I'm to say, will change, which means the portfolio will change. The second change which will happen definitely is in the area of channel. So, for example, e-commerce will pick up. There are no doubts about it. But to what extent it will pick up? Because e-commerce doesn't make money at the end of the day, neither for manufacturer nor for the logistic companies. So e-commerce will pick up, but I think the risk in e-commerce is who makes the money. So will it be only Amazon or Jio at the end of the day? Nobody knows. And then how does the effect it will have on general trade and modern trade? So I think channel will also be a big worry for future. And I think then comes the supply side. You will need to be more bothered as a company about your vendor's supply chain today. How are their cash position? I mean, you have to do a full lot of analysis of their supply chains, how well they are, how well nourished they are, before you start making decisions about your own supply chain planning. So I think there are certain variables which, and I think Dr. Sinha was absolutely right in saying that the nature and the role is different for DDMRP and IBP. It's a question like chicken and egg. I mean, who comes first, which comes first? But I think both are needed together. The resource management, in my view, is the topmost priority going forward.
Vivek, I have been listening to Oliver Wright, and right now, when they have been propagating IBP uses, they have been talking about, as you talked about, or as Dr. Sinha talked about, integrated tactical planning in the short run. How do you really look at this integrated tactical planning during the COVID? Because you have done a brilliant analysis of what would happen. The landscape would change, the portfolio would change, the channel from e-commerce or omni-channel would, complicate things for players, and they need to plan. What about the integrated tactical planning during the period of short runs? Maybe during COVID or even during other time of planning.
And I think the integrated tactical planning basically means that you are working with multiple scenarios. So this is what, I mean, there is a feature in IBP theory which is called what if scenario, what if planning or what if scenarios. I think it's more and more needed today in terms of what if. And normally we used to do, when we used to run IBP, we used to do what if beyond the DDMRP range. So that's how DDMRP range, which we, let's say, call it 0 to 3 months zone, you don't do a what if. I mean, you know what, I mean, you can't as an organization change decisions in that zone. But I think in today's world, and what Saurabh was explaining, that his Chennai DC got stopped because of one day Chennai government deciding not have a lockdown in Chennai. So how does he try to cope with that? Because sales will try to reach still that number, so they will try to divert the demand somewhere. And how he has to respond in terms of agility in the supply chain, how he has to be more resilient. So I think that kind of what if scenarios are needed, even in that short-term zone. But as I said, and I will repeat again and again, cash for me is the only objective I will chase. Because if I have cash and others don't, I will get my market share back.
Thank you, Vivek. I think let me go back to Dr. Sinha before I go back to Saurabh. Dr. Sinha, I have a query again, because how are the decoupling points determined? And when such black swan events happen, and when you see that, markets like what Saurabh has been saying is that has changed dynamically because of the lockdowns, because of the incidence of red, yellow, and green zones. How do you really support your DDMRP planning in decoupling point. But before that, a basic understanding of the principle of decoupling point. What is the scientific basis for this decoupling points?
Yeah, in the supply chain, there is movement of material from one node to another. So typically, if you just take the finished goods, it moves from factory to, in many cases, distribution centers, then to CFAs, then distributors and retailers, and then to the consumer. Now, each of these nodes, as they are called in supply chain planning, are actually decoupling point. The basic philosophy and the basic definition of a decoupling point is where the frequency of supply can be vastly different from the frequency of consumption. Like your frequency of supply to a distributor may be only twice a week, but distributor may be servicing the retailers on a daily basis. Your frequency of supply to CFA may be daily, but its consumption by the distributors could be less frequently. So wherever the frequency of supply is different from frequency of consumption, you need to store material, and that's a decoupling point. So the question is, how much material do you store? But the fact is that it needs to have inventory. So where all should you keep inventory? In a serial production line, if a material is moving from one process to another, you don't need a decoupling point in between, because the frequency of moving out of machine 1 is the same as frequency of consumption by machine 2. But if the same machine is supplying to 5 different finishing lines, you may need a decoupling point there. But largely in finished goods distribution, we need decoupling points because these come in very handy and work as the first level shock absorbers for any spurt in demand. We saw that of late, many FMCG companies were trying to send material directly from CFA to the retailers. Distributors were taking orders, but the supply was made directly by CFA to the retailers by doing away with distributor as a decoupling point. Those companies suffered in pandemic because the first in hyperlocal delivery, the retailers would buy from the local distributor first, and local distributor is just a couple of hours or max a day away from the retailer. So doing away with a stocking point which is so close to consumption is not advisable. So as we move closer to the consumer, the last decoupling point in the supply chain should be as close to the consumer as possible, because the demand goes up, then this decoupling point holds inventory which can meet the additional demand before it gets reinforcement from the previous node. So some amount of shock can be absorbed by this decoupling point. If you do away with distributor inventory, then you don't have that decoupling point. So CFA has to cater to that.
Dr. Sinha, then there is another question that people have in mind, that what is the basis of holding inventory at different decoupling points? Because if you look at the literature, it says that this decoupling point is essentially a compressed lead time to required ranges and determine realistic due dates when needed, set decoupling point buffer levels properly, find high value inventory leverage point for decoupling. Now this essentially requires that you move out from a lead time of a cumulative lead time to a very broken lead time. So how do you determine that lead times? Yeah. Because it's very essential for us to have a decoupling point. The philosophy and the scientific basis for it looks very appealing. But what is the scientific basis for decoupling points? How do you determine them? And I think this is one criticism that a lot of people from the other approaches who use Vivek or SNOP as a aggregate forecast for MRP still have it.
Yeah. So if you see, decoupling points are nothing new. The concept is new, but we see it all around. If you see a staircase from one floor to the next, why do we have 9 steps going down and then take a U-turn? Why do we have a landing there? That's a decoupling point. Because people who get tired, or if something falls on the staircase, it will stop there rather than falling all the 18 steps. It can fall maximum 9 steps. So firstly, it avoids risk in case of a staircase. So wherever around us, we see a lot of decoupling points. We don't notice that these are decoupling points. So when people take rest at the staircase landing, the frequency of people coming into the landing could be different from the frequency of people which are going out of the landing. Again, that becomes a decoupling point. So how much inventory to keep and where to keep the decoupling points is directly related to what type of agility do we want. Are we looking at, are we happy with 90% OTIF service levels of our customers, or are we looking at 2 sigma 95%, or are we looking at 99% plus service levels? If you are looking at 99% plus service levels, irrespective of the demand surge, then the decoupling point closer to the consumer has to have relatively higher inventory, because the demand surges to say 50 times of a normal demand. How do you service it fast? So you need something which is very close, and a good communication mechanism and a good replenishment mechanism from the previous nodes. It's the same thing. How much of firearms should the army keep at the front post before it gets reinforcement from the other base camp? So that is the same question. How much inventory do we need, and where all should the army hold the ammunition? A little bit can be kept at the front post, a little bit in the depot supporting that, and a lot of ammunition can be kept at a central place which can supply to all the depots. So it's the same inventory model that we need to adopt in an FMCG environment.
Saurabh, I think you stopped at this particular point of debate as your introduction and said that in pandemic this kind of 95% service level may not work in the real sense of the term, because the whole dynamics have changed. It has become hyper local, the markets have changed, the factories operations have changed, where and how much labor is available and things like that. What do you think of DDMRP in terms of such disruptions? And do you think you also practice IBP, I see it in a big way, and SNOP? What is the best part of it that you all can bring in to see that such hyper-local market can be serviced?
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Singh. Actually, go ahead, sir.
No, go ahead. We'll come back.
I got completely absorbed with Dr. Sinha and what Vivek were discussing. I was actually taking a lot more notes. So this is a learning opportunity for me. And so I'll tell you what it has brought, this whole piece, what it has brought forward for me is there's no perfect world, right? There's no perfect planning system, right? IBP is needed, DDMRP is needed, but what's really needed is you can have a perfect plan. What's your execution behind it, right? So if your factories are not resilient enough, if the factories don't work, or there's too much disruption there, or if your transportation is completely stopped, or like I talked to you, different geographies go into different type of lockdown, no planning is going to help you there, right? So whether it's a long term or a medium term, and I really like that piece, because it's all about timing, right? A medium term 3-month DDMRP will just not work. It's a 1-week plan. It's actually, for me, a DDMRP is today's plan. What should I execute between today and tomorrow? That's where it works best, right? What it told me, right, is one, forecasting is what we are trying to restart. Right? So for a month or two, we just dumped it because there was no point trying to do it. When we are restarting it, the traditional way is not working. Every time that we try to do that 1 month out, 2 month out, even if you reduce the horizon, the data is so inconsistent, it is continuously throwing up different things. That's where, again, coming back to where I was initially, right? A DDMRP solution or a pull system is actually exposing the chinks in my supply chain, right? So it is telling me that whenever demand has changed, or even if it was uniform, how do I put it? Okay, so Dr. Sinha talked about frequency of supply and frequency of consumption, right? So let's take a product A, which has got a particular frequency of supply once in 2 weeks. If the consumption has gone up, right, I may not be able to change my frequency of supply. So whether it is a DDMRP or an IBP, this problem gets highlighted, and what do we do to sort it out? That's where the two of the things have to come together, because I look at my long-term plan with IBP saying, as per sales and marketing, this 100 today is going to go to 120, 150, 170. And even though I may have enough capacity in one plant, the frequency of supply is not going to allow me to take care of any changes in demand which may happen. So that's the first point, right? The second point, which again, like this control tower or all the data which is around, is telling me that demand is getting shaped differently. Larger packs are getting sold much more. Like Vivek was saying, e-commerce is becoming more prominent. It tells me, therefore, send it and feed it back to the SNOP process. Tell them what is their take on e-com channel growth over the next few years, and then go back to your backend and say, how do I fulfill this changing demand, and what is it on the ground system? Because half my people don't understand e-com. E-commerce for us, even in the last 3-4 years, is a novelty for most of us, right? So it works. Amazon works differently. Flipkart works differently. Big Basket would be working differently. This is the time where we need to quickly upgrade our knowledge. And again, another word that Vivek had used, collaboration. He talked more about collaboration within functions. I'm saying collaborate with your customers quickly and refine and redefine your supply chain towards your customers and therefore to the consumers. Now, who makes money? I think that's a very, very important point, Vivek. Who's going to make money? You have to, of course, protect your margins as a seller. But these are 3 or 4 things where this, in my opinion, IBP, DDMRP will all link together, but it is going to raise a huge number of opportunities across the change. If you've got limited capex, where are you going to put up that capex, right? So you will use IBP inputs to decide a product A versus product B, which is going to give me a better margin, which is going to be better for my cash flow. Let me put my money behind it. Again, most companies that I have spoken to have also delisted a large number of C category SKUs. That is going to help shore up a lot of your bottom line, because these C category were for a reason. Either they were a novelty item, or they were selling too less, therefore the cost to serve is very, very high. This is a good time to clean up your stable, right? Again, when we tried to clean it up, we went back to our IBP to say, what's the long-term plan for this product? Is it strategic in nature? Do you see it growing over the next 1 year? Are you going to put marketing money behind it, right? So for me, it's going to bring a number of things together, and there's no perfect system which I can define, but the principles I think hold true as they were yesterday, as they're going to be tomorrow. And I really like that piece, like Dr. Sinha had said, the principles of supply chain remain same. How are you going to apply it becomes very, very important. I know, have I confused, like you always say that Saurabh confuses me, but that's how I am thinking as a practitioner. I need to bring everything together, and I need to do it very, very quickly.
I think this time you got some clarity into my thinking. And I think that's very interesting. Let me go back to Vivek. Vivek, you talked about portfolio review in terms of pandemic, and I think you've made a very significant point in terms of changing consumer behavior or customer buying behavior, which may just be there. It may not be just pandemic oriented, or there could be some degree coefficient of change that are there. But given this kind of a portfolio review that you may do, what would be your element of demand review? Because that's where you skipped it and you went straight away into strategy. So I wanted to understand a little bit of demand review at this particular point of time.
So as you know, demand review process is fundamentally based on a concept of building block. And in the building block, there is normally, I mean, theory it says there are 8 building blocks, but the biggest building block in demand is the baseline. And just not for you, but for the listeners, baseline is basically a demand which gets built because of series on years and years of effort around channel, product, category, marketing, and therefore you attain a certain baseline. And then you have the remaining building blocks of, like, say, new product, competition, promotion, all of that. Now, what COVID has done is it has actually hurt baseline. It has not hurt the other building blocks. And as I said, baseline is the biggest portion of your demand. So you have to, therefore, I mean, go back to drawing board. If you really ask me, the right approach is divide the teams into two ways. One set of teams should look at completely looking at each and every assumption behind a plan which used to exist before COVID. And the remaining team is what Saurabh is pointing out, battle the day. I mean, they are the ones which are 0 to 4 in my earlier analogy. They are batting, and you don't judge them. They may take the decision. You just tell them, preserve your wickets, which is preserve your cash, and keep doing. and the coach and the other teammates are making that plan which I was talking. So I think that's the way you should divide the effort. And look at the baseline again, because the baseline is a function of what portfolio, what consumer choices you are triggering through your marketing plans, what are the channels, etc., etc. And again, as I said, the complexity of COVID scenario is that you will have to work with more plans. You don't know which plan will come through at what pace. Some categories or some products might show a V-shaped recovery, some might show L-shaped, some might show some another alphabet. You don't know that. So you need to work it out, and a lot of choice making decisions you'll have to make on that front. So as Saurabh was saying, there is no recipe for this. My only suggestion to everybody is don't try to aim for perfection. It's better to be directionally right at this stage than trying to tell each other that we made a mistake. Mistakes will happen, but I think the way you will control those mistakes is by reacting and by responding to the consumer need or to the market need, how it shapes in a faster manner. So I would say don't hesitate to make a decision, but if you continuously reviewing it, continuously working in multiple scenarios, I think you will be able to make it efficient over a period of time.
You made a very interesting statement that demand has stopped. Yes, demand has stopped all around in 196 and 198 countries that are COVID. But this stopped demand would also have a very stopped impact on the GDP of these countries because over a period of time. Maybe in some categories there could be a bouncing back of demand, there could be pent-up demand and so on, but it has affected the livelihood of the people and so is the businesses across. How do you look at such scenarios along with pandemic? And how do you really, build them into the process of planning?
Yeah, so as I said that, and I would say now I'll use our DDMRP and the rest and IBP. So today, if I've been given a choice, I would go and say, let supply chain team and sales team focus on DDMRP, like 0 to 3 months. Let them decide, empowered. The CEO and the CFO should just give them a guideline that this is the guardrails around which you work, and just empower them. And the remaining organization, which is where your bigger advertising budgets, your capital expenditure decisions, your trade promotion decisions, or your channel decisions are sitting, they have to start visualizing the future in the way they best can. So they will, like for example, if I have to tell you about Mondelez, there was a category we have which was supposed to be sell during Ramadan time, and there is a category like biscuits. We saw a surge in biscuits after COVID lockdowns, and we saw a decline in sales in the category which was supposed to sell during Ramadan. Now, instead of trying to push certain things because of lockdown, we were trying to focus on selling more biscuits. Not good for our product mix ratio because we made more money in the seasonal product. But what is important is that we are trying to generate. It's like taking singles in my earlier analogy. Don't try to worry about the run rate you have. Keep running the business, keep generating cash. So that was the approach. The second team then started to look at what is the portfolio, like the decisions which we took, removed C-class SKUs. That was not a DDMRP decision. It's more of a IBP kind of a decision. Focusing your channel investments differently. Putting more money around, a certain, we analyze different modern trade channels, e-commerce, etc. So trying to, making portfolio around that side and making investments around that side. Similar, I'm saying similar kind of decisions, but you need a separate team. I recently read a McKinsey article, and I'm forgetting, sorry for that, the term they used. They said form teams I'm just telling the gist of that. Form teams between commercial and supply chain, which will try to forecast different scenarios and have a action plan basis around that. I'm not saying have 10 scenarios, maybe have 4 or 5 maximum, depending on the size of the company, and then bring it back into the IBP decision table, and therefore you start to choicefully start selecting. I'm not saying that it will make the DDMRP phase of planning easier. It won't be, because a lockdown like what happened in Chennai can happen still, but more or less you are protected by the resource which have been assigned to a certain to people. So this would be my recommendation for most of the organizations.
Dr. Sinha, what would be your recommendation for the long run and overall supply chain strategy and planning? Because as I see from all three of you, DDMRP is nothing but a supply strategy in the short run and shortest of the short run. How do you really build up a long-term strategy for supply chain, and probably during this pandemic, as Vivek has outlined?
Yeah. So if you want to strengthen the supply chain over the longer term, without sacrificing the short-term DDMRP objectives, in my opinion, there are three things which have to be done consistently, irrespective of where we are. We may be highly efficient, we may be less efficient, doesn't matter. But three things which can always be improved in supply chain. One is the concept of batch size, whether it's from the vendors to the factories in terms of the MOQs of input materials or the production runs. Why we take run once in 2 weeks is because of the large batch size that we are used to producing. Or it's in distribution that we send only 16 tonner or 25 tonner. We don't have a 3 tonner or a 5 tonner or a 9 tonner on that lane. What is the batch size in which we operate, and how do we keep improving that batch size, making it shorter and shorter? The second is the flexibility. Again, how flexible are we to change the schedule at a very short notice? Whether it's a distribution plan, for example, can I decide tomorrow morning how many trucks I need to send on a lane, or do I need to decide today evening? If I have to decide today evening, then I'm missing out on what is happening today in the marketplace. That input is no longer there. I have input only till yesterday, but I have the flexibility of deciding tomorrow morning how the distribution plan should be. Then today's sales and marketplace events are also taken into account. So how flexible are we in terms of scheduling our plans, and what's our speed of response? In many cases, we have seen companies operating with a frozen production schedule, for example, for a week, and they say any changes can be brought out only in the second week. So such companies will face problems when the demand is moving abnormally high, if there is a surge in demand. Because unless the speed of response is within 24 hours, if the demand has gone up, and we know it for sure because we have sensed the demand at the consumer end, that the demand has gone up, does it mean that next day within 24 hours we will change our distribution plan, we'll change our production schedule, and we will change our input material orders? If not, then we still have a long way to go in terms of improving the speed of response. So reducing batch size, improving flexibility, and improving the speed of response. These are the three improvement areas which are sort of gold mines, and we can go on and on irrespective of how flexible and how fast we are in responding. There's always scope for improvement. And once we see that we are at the highest level, then I'm pretty sure that a company can meet even 50 or 80% surge in demand pretty easily, because of just the flexibility and fast response that they can have.
Would the capacity be so flexible at the end to meet such surge like what we have seen now? Because one of the biggest reports that comes from some of these supply chain organizations are that in the short run, when you focus on this kind of flexibility, any such kind of surges have shown that demand has never been fulfilled. And I think one element of it was from Saurabh itself. If I just take as this thing that DDMRP may not be able to really take that particular balancing act in itself. So how do you manage that? Because I see it as very simple. Too many data points of inventory fundamentally goes against the principle of lesser variability. More you have points, more is the variability. That's the traditional literature says. And I think I did a study of around 50 organizations. They study only verbal including Saurabh, I have asked him a question, and I think he said there is a huge amount of inventory that lies at each point, and that has been a reason for us to have been able to manage to service hyperlocal market. So I think there are certain elements of this which increases variability, and we have not been able to take care of this particular variability. Is too much inventory being there, and we are talking about a perfection through DDMRP, which may not be so true. How
Actually,
can DDMRP? No, I'm one last line, Dr. Sinha. These are a few questions. How can any mechanism be so perfect that it can bring such a great service level and be so linear in a world which is not so linear?
Yeah. So if you see, any good TOC or DDMRP implementation will improve service level and bring down inventory. If it doesn't bring down inventory, it's not a good implementation. Somewhere we have missed out on some of the essential parameter settings, because of which inventory goes up. Actually, inventory must come down as a rule when you improve service level. And that's just by aligning the supply to demand. Instead of sending supply to the wrong places, which results in excess stocks, it goes to the right places from where it gets consumed. So overall flow in the entire system improves from vendors up to the consumer, and that means that the inventory is less. Now coming back to the capacity, there are two ways in which capacity can be expanded. One is just the flexibility, and it's left to our own imagination how flexible we can be. For example, if you take any liquid filling line, can we convert it to make hand wash? It could be a detergent line, I don't know, but how soon can we convert it and get the, for example, the FDA approval and make a hand wash? It's not easy, but can we do it in a week's time? Can we do it in 10 days time? Then the capacity could just double up or become 3 times or 5 times. If we are using a single shift, can we turn it to a 3-shift operation, in which case the capacity goes up by 200% overnight? If we have been closing it on a weekday, can we get permission from the local authorities to run it all 7 days? Capacity goes up by 17% immediately. If we have been stopping for half an hour for lunch and 2 tea breaks for 15 minutes time, can we have overlapping this so that the machines are always running? Again, your capacity goes up by 15%. So many things by which capacity can go up by 200 to 500% without any additional investment. We have to really look for those avenues. And after that, there is a concept of debottlenecking, whereby any line can run at a rate which is much higher than the rated capacity of the equipment as given by the manufacturers. When we look at OEEs, for example, people have a mental block that if we are at 80%, let's target 85 next year and 90 next year. When it comes to 95, the increment, or rather the planned increment, goes down. From 95, it will be only 96% as the target, not 100%. And when by any chance, if we touch OEE of 100%, that's a mental block that we can't go to 105. It's just in our minds. We have been running plants at 160% of the rated capacity for years together, and not one plant, at least 20 different plants have been running at 160%. So how do we, that's one way of increasing capacity or creating capacity, a zero investment. There are ways of doing it. It's just that we need to have an open mind, and then capacity is hidden so much. We need just a pair of eyes which can look for this hidden capacity and unravel it.
So just to add there, Dr. Singh, all those old techniques that we used to do, the TPM and Six Sigma, those are the techniques that come to fore. And Dr. Sinha was absolutely right. We are wedded to a way of operation, right? That wedding is today has got a diverse. And that's very, very important. This pandemic has helped us go back and re-question the beliefs that we had. Why should it be a 3-shift into 8-hour operation? Why can't it be a 12-hour into 2-shift type of an operation, right? I'm not talking about, just pushing people to work more, but removing all the non-productive time. It's all about the non-productive time. Like Dr. Sinha had said, right? 30 minutes lunch. Do the lines have to stop? Or do you have a couple of people who are acting as a relieving crew, and they, over a couple of hours, they relieve all the people who are going to be there? What we need to achieve is actually, it is the throughput. right? So earlier, and I'll give you an example, again, building on that, earlier I used to fill to demand. So I know there's a 100-ton demand. I will take longer runs. I will send, 20 tons. I'll take 5 runs, fill it. But today, if I execute to what is actually getting sold, I will take that run into 10 different parts and produce a bigger portfolio of products which are actually needed and which will not get stuck in inventory for 2 months. So I only produce which I know has got a flow and will throughput through the system. It will move within the next 15 days. And thereby, I can still achieve a higher output rather than saying that I'm producing to fill an inventory. Inventory is important. And I think I'm not going to go back on that. Inventory is important. But what is the level of inventory? I think this is helping us, particularly me and my organization, question what's the level of inventory that we need to keep.
And that's the fundamental criticism against DDMRP. They don't know how to make the inventory determined. A lot of debate has been there, but let me say another question that before I go to Vivek is that the volume frequency determines the level of inventory at the decoupling point. Now, with the volume frequency, that movement determines this thing, that you need to know the demand at those points. But you are having an inventory which is predetermined on past data then, future data, because if you are servicing a future demand, you are having an inventory which is looking at the future data in some form.
That's the difference. That's static inventory versus dynamic inventory. If you are going to keep that inventory and you're saying, this is the inventory I need to keep, I will not touch it. Whatever the changes in the front or the back, then you are going to be in the past, right? But if you're willing to play around with that inventory at the correct frequency, I'm not saying you reset it every day, but if you're willing to reset that inventory as the conditions change, I think that's the operating word, static versus dynamic.
Saurabh,
and Saurabh, why not reset it on a daily basis?
Sorry?
Why not reset it on a daily basis?
No, it's just that how much is your organization or supply chain capable of taking that change, right? I'm just coming from a practical point of view. I can change it every day. So for example, I'm a big believer, single minute change of plans, like Dr. Singh was saying, which means my plans cannot be frozen. There is nothing like a frozen plan for a week. My plan should change if my market situation has changed. The truck cannot go to Chennai because it's not going to get unloaded there. Let me send the truck wherever or get another truck which will go to Delhi.
My humble submission as an academician is that all approaches today are market driven and they are very responsive. I think, that is where one has to really assess most approaches in the same framework as the DDMRP. Going back to Vivek, what is your take on inventory holding and demand replenishment strategy in an organization? What should be the basis? Now, let me compound the problem for you. A country like India, where we don't know what to do after a CFA or a super stockist, which sells so much to the rural India, how does DDMRP work there? How does any demand-driven replenishment strategies would work there?
So let me, there is an academician approach to inventory. Let me tell you my understanding of inventory. See, inventory in a country like India will continue to be held, and I personally believe that removing the middleman in India will not be easy. And let me explain to you why. And if you have middlemen, you will have middle points or decoupling points of inventory. And I'll tell you why. What I'm saying is, if you look at the net revenue to the MRP gap in India, especially in consumer products. And let me again stress on that point. The gap between MRP less GST versus the price which the organization, the seller or the manufacturer realizes, that typically is in the range of 35 to 45% at best in a FMCG kind of product. Maybe 50. I don't think it will be more than 50. A gross margin of more than 50 is not. So that essentially means that, and if you look at e-commerce, theoretically in India after GST, from a plant you can actually ship to the house of the consumer. So if somebody needs a Synthol soap from Godrej plant to a consumer in Guwahati, it can be shipped by e-commerce. It is happening today. It is possible. Now, if you look at from the consumer side, you will find in Amazon that, or in all these portals, that they're charging freight for it. So the consumer is paying MRP, maybe slightly less, but ends up paying freight. So overall, the price is much more than he would have got, from a kirana store next door to his home. Now, essentially, it says, and I have to tell you a bit of a ratio here, that if the price of the order value divided by the freight on a per kilo or per case basis, if it is not less than 10, somebody will end up losing money. It will be either the consumer, or it will be either the manufacturer, or somebody in between, either the logistic company. So that is a ratio in which you need to go with. Now, another problem with India is that our our fuel costs are much more than anywhere in the world, if you look at, for various reasons. I'm not going to the debate there, but it essentially it actually takes away the advantage we have of lower labor cost when it comes to transportation costs or the logistic cost. So our fuel costs, our energy costs are much higher. Further to that, our capital costs are higher compared to the outside world. But if you look at sum total of what I'm trying to say is, inventory is a function of giving service to the consumer, but what are the enabling resources? So you have less MR, less play to speedily ship the goods because your margins are not that much, but your cost base is much higher because of the various other reasons. Capital costs are higher, your energy costs are higher. So the only way you can manage it is by sharing this load. So when you look at, typically academician approach or a theoretical approach is that middleman is not adding value, but middleman is sharing the burden. He's sharing the burden of logistics, he's sharing the burden of cash. And I think that will continue unless somebody decides to make losses. So, and unless this value chain gets changed, inventory in the system or the decoupling points in the system will remain. There will be a bit of here and there movement, restructuring here and there, but prima facie, I can tell you, unless the value chain changes or the cost side changes, the inventory is not an inefficiency. It is seen as an inefficiency. As a supply chain practitioner, I will say it's an inefficiency, but it is sharing of the burden the whole value chain has to take to make the product reach at an affordable price. Now, coming to this question which you're saying, how you are saying DDMRP can happen, or what is it? I would say take the use of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, I'll tell you how it will help. In our conventional approaches, which I've studied in my college, I'm sure Dr. Sinha studied the same, maybe he has done more research, but we don't have, when we do a regression or when we do an inventory modeling, it actually selects the data in such a way that, for example, if there is a skew in a particular day, or if there is for example, a product might sell on a weekend, or a product might sell on 2 times in a day more than 7 days, it takes out that data out of in the calculation. Otherwise, if you consider every data, then the standard deviation will be so high that it will end up increasing the inventory levels. Now, artificial intelligence can make it more predictable. I will not say 100%, but if you use the right man plus machine combination using AI, you will probably be able to reach a much more dynamic inventory modeling than what is available today in the business. So I think that's the thought on the table for everybody, that the conventional approach, or let me say the conventional knowledge, if you complement with AI or ML based technology, you have a better combination of managing inventory dynamically than what you used to have in the past.
Thank you, Vivek. I think that really is a very important point in the debate. Dr. Sinha, what do we think about this kind of approaches when you start looking and modernizing your supply chain practices through technology and analytics?
Yeah. So what Vivek said is absolutely the way to go. It's the right way to go, because effectively in DDMRP, what we are using is the future daily usage, and we are taking the current average daily usage as a surrogate of how the demand will be over the next 3 days or 5 days. It's just a surrogate. Whereas by using AI and ML, we could have a much better view of how the demand is expected to be at the most granular point, At a store level, SKU level, for example, or at a distributor SKU level, you could do the short-term forecasting over the next 3 days, 5 days, every day to see how the demand is expected, and that will take care of not only seasonality, but also some of the seasonality which is induced by our own salespeople, the month-end SKUs that we see. So in the first week of the month, the sales are expected to be lower. Not only the primary sales, but even the secondary sales from distributors to the wholesalers are low in the first few days. So by using this AI-based forecasting tools, the key is not allow too much of human overrides. The moment you start allowing human overrides, it will suffer the same fate as the conventional forecasting, where people will play with it so that their own KPIs improve. That's not really required. So do it on a daily basis, do it at the most granular level, and do it in a pure AI way without human overrides. And I know a few companies who have this model, who are working on this model. I'm also mentoring some of them as to how to build this model, and they have come out and they are catering to some of the e-commerce companies, the online companies, and suddenly their both forecast accuracy and the fulfillment has shot up by, in case of some e-commerce companies, by as much as 15 percentage points by switching over to this short-term forecasting model using AI. So it is the way to go, and the benefits would be more for companies who don't have a very set demand pattern. But nevertheless, even the companies with set demand pattern, the large FMCG companies, would also benefit by using this forecasted daily usage, FDU, instead of projecting just the ADU for the next 3 days. So Vivek is absolutely right. That's the way to go.
Saurabh, what would be your suggestion for planning in the immediate, near, short, and long run? What are the factors and more strategic factors that we need to take into account while preparing for the long run now?
So for me, I think the biggest piece is information, right? And that's what most of the organizations today would be suffering from. A control tower approach, you call it, or whatever you call it. What is the transparent and frequency of information that you are able to work with? Right, so it's no longer going to be that once a week I go over all my inventory norms, I check what my production plan, I only review it at the end of the week. All those things. You need to get the information what was sold yesterday. It needs to be available. It needs to go across the organization. Otherwise, you're first not going to be able to make any decision because you just don't have the information. You can't work in this situation, dynamic situation, on instinct alone, which a lot of companies are trying to do. Those who have not done digital ways of working. That's number one. Number two is this is the time to transform, which means if you don't have a very solid digital backbone or an ERP backbone, this is the time that you need to decide. Of course, it will depend on whether you're able to afford it or not. But very soon, if you don't do it, that question of whether you live or die will be decided by your digital backbone, let's call it, right? The third thing would be, and this is where I slightly differ from Vivek and Dr. Rakesh, not in the terms that AI is the way to go. It is, if I don't even have a digital backbone or a strong ERP today, how do I go to AI? Right, number one. Number two, there are so many people who are peddling AI as a answer, and or rather as service providers who come and say, this is the problem, this is the solution, put it on, and it your problem is going to get disappeared. People need to be very careful on the choices they make, and for me, it's going to be a 2 or a 3-stage process. Get your ERP right. Put in good human-assisted algorithms, as I like to call them, human-assisted programs where you do interfere because you can't leave it. There are a lot of black boxes in an AI. If I don't know how it works, I'm not going to leave all my decisions to it because then tomorrow it will be open to question. But use that and make your logic, your algorithms understood well throughout the organization. Then move to the next stage where you leave it to an autonomous program, right? With minimum human interference, remove that bias. That piece I'm completely, how you do that journey is going to be a 2 or a 3-step process, but start now. If you don't start now, then in another 3-6 months, as this become even more dynamic, you are going to suffer even more. That would be my broad-based input into this.
Vivek, the last question to you, as we have run out of time rather. how do you think IBP would be evolving from now on till the world start becoming normal or new normal or next normal, whatever it is? What are the 3 or 4 things that you suggest would be important to take into account while improving our planning? You already talked about technology, so let's skip that.
I think as I said, it will be what has changed in IBP. Conceptually, I think nothing with the COVID crisis. I mean, you need to do the same thing, same process, same discipline, same cadence. But I think the how has dramatically changed, and I will say how has changed in 2 ways. One is there is a more manual intervention needed. I mean, when I say manual intervention, more focus from the top management needed, more attention to details is needed, more knowledge about market variables and understanding of it is needed. So I think the depth in which you need to go now versus pre-COVID, that has to be much more detailed. Your radar of watching many other variables which you probably never used to, that is equally important. For example, you should watch I would say you should watch many other adjacent industries. You should watch the headwinds in the economy which might affect your organization or your categories of product. So there's a lot more macro information as well as micro detailing which is needed from that perspective. So the how has changed from that perspective. The second is you will, as Saurabh was pointing out, great time for you to assess what capability needs you need to make your whole organization and not just supply chain. And I like this word resilient. And resilient as a word, in my view, every organization should decide and define in its own manner which suits it. And therefore, capability to make it more resilient is a clear opportunity where organizations leadership should put their head around and make a task force and try to do it. Now, if one of it outcome can be that I need to do an AI or ML based technology driven stuff, then the question comes, how do you do it? Which was like Saurabh was saying that he has a bit of kind of a disconnect on that. But I think digitalization, and he's right. I mean, you need to have some basic fundamental capability to drive it. Your maturity of the organization, most importantly, I think how are you going to do it? I mean, there are 3 roles which you need to create when you're doing a digitalization initiative. One is a business translator, which is a kind of a hybrid role between business skills and analytical skills. Then you need to create roles like data architect, which is business stroke technology expert. And then there is a data scientist, which is between technology and analytical skills. So these are the 3 roles, this triangulation of roles you need to create. Then only you will be successful in driving this digitalization capability. So a lot from the capability. Sorry.
What about the interface between short-term and long-term planning goals?
I think that the short-term and the long-term disconnect even happens today. I think the biggest challenge in IBP is how do you actually make the long-term and the short-term talk in a manner that it is efficient for both. In today's world, it is actually even more difficult. I'll be very frank to admit that. And the only way to do it is, as I said, when you are, I mean, I'm going back to the original cricket analogy that when the ball is swinging and you are a batsman, you have to be more watchful. That's the only way you have to do it. I mean, you have to be more watchful, you have to be more collaborative. Your other aspects of the business should run in such a manner that if you are in a very volatile environment, you are holding hands of each other and somebody is telling what is happening and somebody is telling. So no 100% information sharing is key to it in a manner. But these challenges will not be easy to overcome. The only way I can think of is more of collaboration, more of information sharing, and side by side working on improving the capability in processes, in systems, in people, in technology, infrastructure, everything.
Thank you, Vivek. And I think we have come to the end of this discussion. Thank you, Dr. Sinha. Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you, Vivek. I think it has been a great learning for me sitting here and just have the luxury of just asking few questions. Thank you very much. But let me also summarize the debate and put some points into perspective. I think all of us agree that moving from here onwards, analytics will play a big role, and any analytics will require a huge digital platform or a right digital platform to work. And why analytics? Because the big data analytics is slightly different than data and statistics that we talk about, the data sciences that we talk about. It can actually understand the pattern of the data and build hypotheses based on the pattern of data based on chaos theory. And I think that is the fundamental difference what Vivek was talking about, what everybody agreed. And that could be a very strong source of connecting the entire supply chain to the last tier 2, tier 4, tier 5, tier 7 suppliers. So suppliers, manufacturing unit, your transportation, your distribution, warehousing. Because if you see in pandemic, it is securing your supply, preserving your cash, securing your transport, and securing your warehouses have been the major challenges, and that is where the resilience can come in. Secondly, I think we need to move out from however reflexive a deterministic model is to a more resilient model of planning, ensuring that the short run and the long run interact, as Manish and Vivek write a beautiful article which is available on scmpro-knowledge.in, that short run should ensure the long run objective. And I think it is very important not to lose this point at this particular point of time, and build up mapping ability to see where gaps arises, because assuming that few planning techniques are very agile, they may still have certain element of gaps that may arise. Are we mapping those? What is the mechanism to map up your bills of material right in the tier 7 this thing? And I've been looking at some good work done by Resilient and Lamasoft organizations, and seeing that all these techniques may become one as we go ahead. And I think the data supply chain, or what Dr. Sinha calls RIP forecasting, essentially means that everything will be seamless and we can actually manage the gap with digital twin. And I think I agree with Saurabh there that you have physical, digital, so digital twin would be there. But I go back to Vivek and I agree that organizations will remain organizations. There'll be politics, there'll be everything. Assuming that, you'll have a linearity can be dangerous. Can we have a kind of, IBP frameworks where everybody differences, frameworks, understanding, and politics comes in and gets minimized. And I think organization will still need a very robust cross-functional collaboration and cross-enterprise collaboration in the future for any planning mechanism to become not just deterministically resilient. And I think with that we have a few questions that we'll take up. And any questions that are there? Yeah, there. From Abhijit Devdar, we work in West African countries like Nigeria, where due to COVID, there is a 30% devaluation of local inventory. Hence, your cash flows are in difficulty. How do we handle such situation, Vivek?
I mean, as I said, cash is paramount, because imagine cash is the blood in the body. So if in an organization, what the role of blood is in the body, that's the role of cash in the organization. So if you are getting squeezed on cash, you will have to take some tough calls and either change your product manufacturing or you're selling. But there is no going way. I mean, you have to preserve cash. Without cash, your business will come to a halt. So I think this is your organizational dynamics. You'll have to make some difficult decisions to preserve cash. I mean, in our company, I'll tell you what we did. I mean, just to supplement what I'm saying, we sell to our distributors on cash, so we don't give any credit. And in this crisis also, we stick to that principle. When cash was getting squeezed out, we had to take down our sales, but we did not want to take the risk of giving credit, especially in business like Nigeria.
Has Dr. Singh dropped out?
I think so. I can't see him.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Dr. Sinha, there is a question to you. It says that in the absence of point of sale data in Indian market, wouldn't it DDMRP also lead to a very strong bullwhip effect?
So it's important to get this demand sensing as close to the consumer as possible. I agree that getting point of sales data is not possible, especially if your products are sold at 50 lakh or 60 lakh outlets, which is true for many FMCG companies, because India has about 100 lakh outlets, and most of them are non-computerized. So if you can't get a point of sale data, retail data, let's move a step back. Can we get data of our distributor sales to retailers, which I find in many FMCG companies is available at the most granular level, at an invoice level, which means to each retailer on a daily basis, SKU wise, what has been sold. That's a good enough place to start for demand sensing. But in certain industries where distributors don't cooperate as well as in FMCG, for example, in some of the pharma chains, distributors don't share this daily sales data. We have to move one step more backward and see that at our selling point, do we have this data? And there definitely we would have this data. So wherever you start, take that as a demand sensing. It's going to be a little bit inefficient as you move away from the consumer. So our endeavor should always be to keep moving closer and closer. But if it's just not possible to get at the granular daily level that data, it's better to move one step back and get it at the granular level, because granularity and frequency are extremely important for running DDMRP. We should not compromise on that. We can compromise on the distance from the consumer, but not on the granularity and frequency.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one of the just start off, you'll have to figure out which is the best data that you have. You start from there, and the data and the inventory model keeps getting refined as you go forward. I don't think you're going to reach your ideal inventory or the level or the plan within the first stage. You will refine it, and suddenly the demand may change. You might have gone wrong somewhere. But like Dr. Sinha said, we'll have to start at some point. You can start with saying that I'll do a 1 sigma standard deviation management instead of a 3 sigma, and then as the inventory model becomes stronger and stronger, you can decide which way you want to go.
All right, there is another question. The decoupling point debate is not new. Decoupling nodes have existed in traditional supply chains. Just the approach has changed, where we have moved closer to the customer. We have to take them back to where the labor is, and also we need to urgently start diversifying our procurement and open up to local sourcing by moving closer to ancillary manufacturing clusters. But that is a debate for another time. My point being, local sourcing uses a supplier as a decoupling node. Thus, we need to understand what goes into our new decoupling node, just like we need to know what goes in our APOs. So if we can discuss the floaters that play a major role in DDMRP success in short-term, high incidence period. Is it just noise sensing, or there is something new that the approach suggests? Saurabh,
a very, very complex question.
Dr. Sinha, if you have understood the question, you can actually answer it.
I'm not sure if anyone has fully understood such a long question and kept moving from one point to another. But yes, if you are just asking your vendors to hold inventory instead of you, that's not good implementation of DDMRP. What you should do is take out inventory from the combined system, not just push the inventory from your raw material go down to the vendors, which I have seen personally in many automobile companies. They work on jet, but their vendors who are located close by, they carry huge inventory. That's not a good implementation. Ultimately, we have to look at the complete system inventory from vendor up to the consumer, and that should become lean. It should flow properly. It's not enough to just look at inventory within the company's system of raw materials and finished goods, but go further to the distributors and retailers and on this side up to the vendors, and calculate their inventory as well. And the overall inventory should come down to make the flow leaner. So that would be, and decoupling points help us in doing that.
So
I'll just add one thing.
Answering this would be that you connect your suppliers also to the same planning system that you have, so they also get the visibility, and then they can plan more efficiently, right? That could be possibly one of the ways.
I'll just add one point to the decoupling question. If you want to really get after and chase decoupling, you have to substitute it with capability on planning, capability on logistic execution, capability of information sharing. So if you're trying to reduce inventory and not substituting it with something else, you will fail. So, and I think most of the organization missed that point. They try to look at inventory through the lens of inventory model formula, whereas it's a question of how the network is, how the replenishment frequency can be, what is the frequency at which SKU gets manufactured, what is the frequency at which an SKU gets replenished from manufacturing to a DC. So there's a whole lot of complex things, and there's information sharing which needs to happen. So decoupling point inventory reduction is a project in itself, in my view, which is highly linked to the capability you are building in the organization.
Thank you, Vivek. And there's another question to you. Jara is profitable with limited touch points, origin to store, customer direct, designed to sell, lead time is around a week only. Are these best practices follow DDMRP norms or IBP for FMCGs? Please advise. You mean to say that does IBP and DDMRP also apply to fast fashion product company like Jara?
So I think I studied Zara a long time back, so maybe they have changed a lot. But what I liked about, and my knowledge might be outdated, what I liked about Zara is that they, I don't know whether they use IBP or DDMRP, but I can just comment on their planning system that they actually look at the data of what the consumer is buying. They analyze the consumer analytics and the consumer behavior, and then end up using that data to create the fashion, clothes, etc., using that data. So in my view, their horizon is long. It's not a small planning horizon business. It's just that they have the ability to do it very, very well. And I think there's a lot to learn from them from that perspective. So we may call it IBP or DDMRP. I'm not into that debate, but I can tell you that they have, as an organization, a great capability to plan really long lead times in a manner which is very efficient, and that gives also them a good profitable business.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add on this? I think in
Only one point about Zara, Dr. Singh.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, one point about Zara is their transit times. They have particularly worked on faster transit times, and it's a fact that every time you crash the transit time between two nodes, the inventory at the downstream node would go down because the transit times are faster, and most of the material moves by air freight in case of Zara. So they have really cut down the transit time, and thereby they are much more resilient, much more I would say the synchronized between supply and demand, because the overall transit time from manufacturing till the consumer endpoint is quite low, maybe as low as 7 days. So they have gone all the way, and they are basically a TOC company, and DDMRP is an offshoot of TOC. So they would follow all the concepts, not necessarily of DDMRP, but of its parent principle, that is TOC.
Dr. Singh.
Hello.
Dropped out again, I think.
Sorry, gentlemen, I think we lost Dr. Singh, and I think the session was really interesting, and I thank all of you all for being there, and I'm sure it is very well justified to the theme and a very good takeaway for the audience today. Thank you, Dr. Sinha. Thank you, Vivek. Thank you, Saurabh, for being there. I would also like to thank all my attendees for being there. Do join us and follow us on our social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and keep attending our webinars. We'll be announcing our next Town Hall series very soon. And you can also visit our knowledge portal www.scmpronowledge.in for latest articles and blogs. We also have our community. In case if you're interested to become a community member of Institute of Supply Chain Management, do write to us and we shall give you the information. In the month of July, we are launching courses and certification in the domain of supply chain and also launching a leadership program R42. So we will send you the details and look forward for association. A big thank you to the entire ISCM team, Yvonne and everybody for making it happen. Thank you, team ISCM, and thank you, gentlemen, for being there. Thank you, Dr. Singh, and thank you all my panelists again. Thank you.